Well, a very warm welcome back all my YouTube subscribers and to any browsers who are joining us for the very first time. Now I hope you're all still in good health and that the dreaded COVID lockdown is beginning to ease slightly in whichever part of the world you're currently living in. Now continuing on with our current series looking at those Swedish made Huskies, regular visitors to my channel may already be familiar with one or two of the bikes in this part 2 clip, but nevertheless they are all good examples and are well worth another look. So hang around for the next few minutes as we check out more of those classic Twinshock Husqvarnas. Now just to get things underway, our first featured machine is Scottish classic racer Tommy Anderson's 250. Now this particular bike could be a 1975 machine, although Tommy is one of those riders who is forever swapping and changing bits and pieces on his race bikes, so it could actually be a bit of a hybrid in that respect. But although it may not look it, this is still a very fast little 250 in the capable hands of Tommy. Now during the 2019 racing season, this bike took Tommy to a 3rd place overall finish in the under 300cc championship, and he also secured a 3rd place overall finish in the over 40s age group championship in this very same year. And so as you can see, maybe Tommy's old Swede is not too much to look at, but you can't argue with the data and the bike's performance on the racetrack. Now it's also pretty fair to say that Tommy is a die-hard Husky fan, and he's been riding these bikes at scramble events from a very young age, because he once told me that it's the lightness of the chassis and the powerful 250 Husky motor that make these Husqvarnas so likeable as race bikes. And of the many years that I've personally watched Tommy racing, he's never raced anything other than one of these Swedish 250s. Okay, next up it's another Scottish classic, and this example of a 1974 250 belongs to Stephen Shaw. Now this is Stephen's backup machine, as he normally races his other race bike that you can see here in the background, which is his old CZ twin port 250. But this is another example of a nice 74 250, not fully original as you've come to expect, but then again many of these older Huskies aren't 100% authentic due to their aging years. But despite that, Stephen's machine still appears to have many of its original factory fitted bits and pieces intact, including this exhaust system, although the rear shocks look like a more modern replacement. Now these 250s were sometimes referred to as the MAG 250s due to its magnesium engine casings. Now the bike also had a 36mm carburettor as standard, although Stephen has opted for a more modern Mikuni on his particular bike. Now these 250s also had the same 4-speed gearbox that was fitted into its bigger brother's power plant, the Big 400. But back in 1974 these were pretty awesome bikes, and everyone and their dog just wanted to own one, although with a price tag of $1,495 in 1974, these were a lot more expensive than, say, an equivalent TM400 Suzuki, which was only $1,205. Now, this lovely bike is just one of two machines we'll be featuring from Herefordshire dirt bike collector and builder Terry Pickering. Now, this first machine is his recently restored 1977 390. Now, this beautiful bike actually started its life as not really a bike at all, as it was built using spare Husqvarna parts that Terry had lying around in boxes in his workshop. Now, although Terry supplied all the parts and components to build the bike, the actual restoration and assembly was entrusted to Terry's friend and ex-Myco factory racer, Keith Ree. Now, Keith has built many machines for Terry in the past, and this 390 was just the latest in a long line of restoration projects that Keith has completed. Now, the Husky's engine is a single-cylinder two-stroke motor with a bore of 83mm and a stroke of 71mm, with normally a reed valve block feeding the motor from a Bing carburetor, although a more modern Mikuni is now being used in our featured bike. Now, these bikes also had Motoplat electronic ignition and a 6-speed gearbox with a standard wet multi-plate clutch. Now, back in 1977, these 390s straight out of the showroom would have set you back about $1,895, which wasn't cheap for the time, but to be fair, you were getting quite a bit of motorcycle for your hard-earned cash. But every part on this bike has been painstakingly made as new again, and the finished bike looks very similar to one that you would have seen if you were to walk into your local Husqvarna dealership in 1977. But in terms of the bike's overall looks, for me personally, the black and chrome tank with the silver frame and the white plastics just all seemed to come together perfectly, and Keith and Terry were just highly delighted the way that this particular project had come together. But the actual workmanship and the finish on this 390 is just superb, and if you've ever watched any of my other videos featuring Terry's old classic dirt bikes and of course Keith's bike building skills, then you'll know the sort of quality machines that Terry has in his possession. Now, Terry constantly has bike building projects for Keith to tackle on an almost monthly basis, and when Terry gets some free time of his own, he also sets to work on his own bike building ventures. But Terry already has an impressive assortment of rare vintage dirt bikes and is adding more bikes on a regular basis, which is helping him to assemble one of the most diverse and unique collections of rare motocrossers in the south west of England. Now, our next featured bike is another brief look at Brian Allardyce's 1982 430 CR Husqvarna. Now, this particular bike of Brian's has been featured in a few classic dirt bike magazines in the past, and if you're a regular visitor to my channel, you may have already had a look at the extended video on this bike. Now, Brian's 430 was actually made from two old Husqvarna donor bikes. Now, the 430 motor was taken from this old enduro machine that Brian purchased some time back, and the bike's frame was also taken from this other old 250 bike that he bought as a job lot. Now, as you would expect, every single part of the 430 motor was dismantled, inspected and rebuilt with a brand new crankshaft assembly, piston kit, and it also had a rebore. Now, a more modern style Mikuni carburetor was changed for the original Bing that came with this 430 donor engine. but every other engine part underwent a full inspection and renovation, and if it didn't come up to specifications to fit into the new engine, it was then scrapped and a new part put in its place, to finish off with what is essentially a brand new motor. Now, Brian also opted to fit these new heavier duty foot pegs to his new bike, which are much better and offer a lot more support for the rider's feet. Now, a new gear shifter pedal was also put on in place of the well-worn original item, but the motor's stock kickstarter was just reused. Now, the original rear shocks were fully refurbished with new valve blocks, seals, and of course new oil, and the reservoirs regassed. Now, all the bike's control cables and levers were actually taken from the old 430 donor bike, as these were almost brand new and were fully serviceable. Now, also the exhaust system on the old 430 donor bike was just scrapped basically, so Brian ordered a brand new expansion chamber and tailpipe from Husqvarna Specialist's HVA factory, which turned up just a few days after ordering the item. But as I mentioned earlier, there is a full and more comprehensive video on this bike here on my channel if you'd like to check it out, or you can just grab a copy of issue 69 of the VMX magazine, where you can then read all about exactly what was done on this superb machine. Okay, next up it's the turn of Colin Flockhart's very tastefully restored 1975 250. Now, Colin originally bought this bike as a running wreck from a fellow racer who was looking to thin out his herd of old classic dirt bikes. Now, Colin did a full restoration on the bike, and during the strip down he noticed that the rear part of the frame was out of alignment, as it appeared that the bike had flown through the air at one time and had landed hard on its back side. But Colin corrected the misalignment and then prepped and painted the frame back to as new condition, and every other part on the bike got the very same treatment to make it look as good as new. But during the engine strip down, Colin discovered that the barrel had a broken liner, which was then repaired by a local engineering shop, where it was then re-sleeved and rebored with a new piston and crankshaft. Now, as you would expect with a full motor rebuild, all the bearings, gaskets and seals were also replaced to make the engine good to go. Now, the engine originally came with a flat slided Mikuni carburetor, which Colin didn't think was right for a 1975 250, so he replaced this for another Mikuni that was more appropriate for the bike's year. Now, the bike's old rear shocks were basically toast, so Colin opted for a pair of these classic rock shocks on the rear, which are perfectly suited to these older Husqvarnas. Now, of course, a brand new set of sprockets and new drive chain were again fitted to the new bike, and many of the bike's older nuts and bolts and any other fasteners that were past their best were actually scrapped, and Colin then manufactured brand new ones in stainless steel. Now the bike's expansion chamber is a new item, as the original once again was past its best, and this tailpipe is again a brand new part from D&G, the motorcycle exhaust specialists. Now the front and rear mudguards are supplied by UFO and of course not HVA factory as stated here on the sticker. Now the bike's original fuel tank also was refurbished and then repainted, and Colin also made up this nice pair of alloy bar risers. Although the entire bike here has been very well presented, and the new mounting bolts and fasteners that Colin manufactured just complement what is already a stunning restoration. Now the original wheels on the old bike were reused and were basically just cleaned up, and a new set of heavy duty spokes laced into the original brake hubs. And naturally these were finished off by fitting a pair of Michelin cross competition tyres front and back, just to make sure that the little husky can get hooked up when it actually takes to the track. Now here you can see better the alloy bar risers that Colin made to raise the ride height of the handlebars. But not long after Colin completed the bike, naturally he wanted to show it off, and so he placed the bike on show at the Scottish Motorcycle Show, where it promptly walked away with the top prize in the best dirt bike category. You need to pump the petrol down a wee bit. Okay, moving on. This is a machine that I covered for a magazine feature some years ago, and this is Paul Toulouse's 1982 250. Now once again this bike has been given the full-on restoration treatment, and Paul had originally bought this bike in plastic boxes, as the previous owner had stripped the bike down completely with a view to rebuilding it, although he never actually got round to doing it. So anyhow, to cut a long story short, Paul managed to buy the boxes of parts from the owner for just £950, and then he set about refurbishing or replacing each and every part. Now some of the motivation to complete this bike actually came from Paul's late father, who owned and raced one of these machines back in the day, and Paul thought it would be a nice tribute to his dad if he could restore this bike and bring back some good memories of when he used to help out his father at local race events. But basically everything that needed done on this bike was completed, and because this was Paul's very first attempt at restoring anything, let alone an old dirt bike, he wanted to do his very best to make sure that it was all done right. So things including the frame and the motor and other parts like the tank and the seat and the front and rear suspensions were either made up to as new condition once more, or brand new parts were substituted in their place. But Paul told me that the restoration took him about a full year to complete, but of course that was in between doing his full-time occupation as a heavy plant operator and all his other family commitments. Although I have to say that as a first time attempt at an old classic dirt bike restoration, Paul has done a superb job on this bike. Now these kind of bike building projects are tough enough even if you know what you're doing, but you have to give some credit to Paul for taking on a project that wasn't even a bike at all initially, but just boxes of Swedish bike parts. But for me personally, I'd give Paul 10 out of 10 for his efforts, and I'm sure also that his late father would be giving him a well done pat on the back for his determination and workmanship in trying to bring back those happy times when they both used to go to these local motocross events. But Paul says he's very happy at the way his virgin restoration has turned out, and now that he's been bitten by the classic dirt bike restoration bug, he's already looking for project number 2. Okay, to finish off our part 2 video on classic Twinshock Husqvarnas, as promised, this is the second machine from the Terry Pickering collection, and this is his 1977 390 CR. Now this fantastic specimen, although owned by Terry, is another bike put together by classic bike building wizard Keith Ree. Now again, and as in the previous 390 we featured earlier, most of the parts used to construct this bike were again supplied from Terry's mountainous spare parts bins. Now as you would expect, first of all the old Husqvarna bike chassis was cleaned and then inspected, and any repairs carried out before it was then prepped and painted in this nice Husqvarna silver colour. Now the 390 engine naturally underwent a full rebuild, and every single component inside the motor was either refurbished to its new condition or replaced with brand new old stock parts. Now also a brand new 38mm Mikuni carb was used to supply the fuel through the newly fitted reed valve block. Now as you know, Husqvarna used lots of magnesium on these bikes to keep the overall weight of the bike down to the very minimum. And with the engine casings, the front and rear brake backplates and other parts manufactured in magnesium, this was still a very light bike for an open class Twinshock racer. Now if you had waited until the following year, you could buy an automatic version of these 390s in 1978, although they were not as popular as these conventional clutch and gear shifter models. Now these 390 Huskies also had very long legs for a Twinshock motocrosser, giving the rider about 13 inches of travel on the front end, and these forks were of course oil and air assisted. Now these simple brake drums had decent stopping power for a 1970s machine, as long as the conditions were dry of course, but if it was a wet, muddy race event then you had to plan ahead if you were thinking of making some kind of emergency stop. But overall the front end on these bikes was pretty good, and they were certainly not any worse than other machines of their time. Now the chassis, and especially this rear swing arm, was very strong and quite light compared to other similar motocross bikes, and this made these 390s very flickable when it came to manoeuvring on the racetrack. Now luckily, one of these extremely rare Husky fuel tanks was one of the parts that Terry had in his spare parts bins, and this was completely stripped of the old paint and then repainted with new graphics, and a new fuel tap and also a new fuel cap was then added. Now the old Husqvarna seat base and foam was reused, and then Evo Max Motocross then came up trumps with a brand new seat cover to make it all look like brand new again. But it was actually very hard to tell that this was not a brand new old stock item. Now the exhaust system is a refurbished original item, and this underwent major restoration to remove all the dings and battle scars from the previous bike that it was actually fitted to. And again, it is quite hard to distinguish this from the original factory fitted item. And this is another very nice restoration job on this exhaust performed by Keith Ree. Now the tailpipe again received the very same care, and once again painted in this matte black. It is another quality restored item. But some of the smaller items, including the control cables, the levers and throttle gasser, are all brand new purchase parts. But that was just mainly because Keith didn't think it was worth restoring these smaller parts, and it was much easier just to purchase them brand new. Now the entire project, from starting with a pile of parts to its eventual completion, seen here, took Keith about 3 months to finish, though he said he had to wait in between the various stages of the restoration, waiting on parts like the engine to be completed and all the other paintwork finishing. Now Keith already has Terry's next projects in his workshop and in various stages of its restoration, but he won't tell me exactly what they are, so we'll have to wait until I actually feature them here on my video channel. But this is another cracking machine, and Terry is indeed a very lucky man being able to add this big beauty to his already vast collection of old motocrossers. So I hope you enjoy this latest assortment of old Swedish Huskies, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel to see more of these Twinshock Husqvarnas in part 3, where we will be taking a look at a few big 4-stroke examples. This video was brought to you in association with VMX Magazine, your #1 publication for classic, vintage and off-road motorcycles. Just visit their online website for more information.